Welcome everyone to this session. Yes, recording in progress. As John said, my name is Alinda Kokkinou. My mom chose my Dutch first name. My dad gave me the Greek last name. And that was the beginning of a mixed match of cultures. I'm what they call a third culture kid. I grew up in between cultures, so I don't really identify with any single culture. And to be very honest, until I was 30 years old, I didn't realize that intercultural was a thing. For me, it was always about adjusting to the environment that you're in, understanding what drives people. That was just the way I did things. And then I came to the Netherlands and I had to teach intercultural management. And I realized, wait a second, this is the story of my life. And that brought upon a series of research projects that I'm going to briefly go through. So I would like to also first apologize for the false advertising, because this session was going to be about critical success factors of lean in higher education across cultures, research-based. But then I had a few talks with some of the respondents that filled out the survey and the Miro board, and I'll explain them in a second. And they said, yeah, but how can we use this information? So I added the subtitle, how can we add it to our own lean or continuous improvement implementation? And I'm going to focus on lean in higher education because I've discovered that we are our own culture in higher education, and we have to do things our own way. So that's going to be a bit the storyline in the presentation. There's going to be some science as well. You can't take the academic out. So just to give you an overview of the topics, I'm first going to give you a brief, hopefully, background of the study, how it all came about, why we did the things we did, a bit about the methods. I'm going to keep it as short as possible, but I did get quite a few questions before the session about which methods did you use. So I'm going to briefly explain it. My findings, so what did I find from the participants of Lean in Higher Education? And what can you do in your day-to-day work with what I found? So how did it start? Well, I came to the Netherlands 12 years ago now, and I started working for an international business school. And because my background is in operations management and in process improvement, I always had to supervise the students that tried to improve processes. And as an international business school, our students went to China to improve the processes of a German automotive. They would go to Spain to implement a process that was thought up in the Netherlands. So, imagine you're a big beer company and you want to improve processes across your subsidiaries. So you come up with this great process improvement plan in the Netherlands, and then you send people across the world to implement it in the subsidiaries, and it doesn't work. And everyone knows that culture probably has something to do with that, but what? And that's how the project came upon. And I was very happy that I got a subsidy to study that for 2 years. And the first thing I did was try to understand critical success factors, because many people before me had gone there and studied critical success factors. And everyone knows what they are. They're a senior leadership commitment. So if the top doesn't buy it, then it's not going to work. Management involvement, so managers need to be involved, ask questions, be interested, allocate resources, of course. And it needs to be about the customer, because if you improve something, it needs to be about the customer. And a link to the business strategy. So if we're coming up with processes,
Jeremy.
Improve things, they should be linked to the business strategy. Rewards and recognitions is one that works really well in North America and some Anglo-Saxon countries, but much less well in Europe and in the Netherlands, for instance, and training. So those are the key critical success factors. Brilliant. I was so happy. I started my project trying to link them to cultural factors. And then I made this beautiful, beautiful conceptual model, because when you're doing academic research and you're trying to get a grant, conceptual models are really necessary. And then I got stuck because I had all these great critical success factors, but every paper I read had a list of these are the most important ones. And every paper had a slightly different order or a completely different order. And it turned out that most academic research tries to come up with one single truth of which are the critical success factors, and they work all the time and for everybody. And that's just not true. And then COVID hit, so my brilliant research project had to take a different direction. And what we tried to focus on is, well, maybe we should bring some nuance to this idea of critical success factors. They're not all true all the time for all the companies. There's definitely different perspectives. And what we realized is those perspectives are dependent on national culture. They're dependent on organizational culture. So different industries, for instance, but different types of organizations will do things differently and appreciate other things. And of course, on the continuous improvement methods, because we tend to talk about Lean and Six Sigma, continuous improvement, all these terms get interchanged a lot. But in practice, they are different philosophies with different principles. So we used a method called Q methodology. And this method has the advantage of, it's a qualitative method. It makes the subjective objective. So in other words, you have a group of people with different perspectives on something, qualitative research, and then you try to bring some objectivity into it. And this is what those of you that participated in the survey actually did. So you have people, each with their own perspective. You identify a series of statements, don't try to read them. The font is too small. But what you do is you force people to make choices. And a limitation of the existing research is that most studies are, how important is this factor to your Lean implementation on a scale from 1 to 5? And unsurprisingly, everything is important. And some of my participants in the study also made that point, that even if I put it on the left side, it's still important. It's just less important than the rest. So what Q methodology does is you present a series of statements, in this case 32, to respondents, and you ask them to put them in order of most important to least important. And it's a forced distribution. So everything could be important, but some things have to be more important than the other. And then the method itself is very simple. It's basically, if you're familiar with statistics, it's a factor analysis, but on its side. Instead of grouping statements together, you're grouping people together. That's why we call it Q. It's a factor analysis on its side. And based on that, the output is a set of perspectives that represent the views of a group of people. And I came up based on the data that I collected also through Lean in Higher Education with a certain number of perspectives, and I'll explain them a little bit later. So we repeated the same process 3 times. The intention is still to do it a 4th time. And we tried to come up with homogeneous groups versus heterogeneous groups in terms of culture, because our interest is culture, in terms of national and international, but also in terms of business. So for instance, we started with a Dutch group. So all kinds of different businesses, so heterogeneous industries in a single culture. So we talked to over 50 companies in the Netherlands, had them go through the sorting exercise. And what they had in common is that all were in the Netherlands, but it was different businesses. We then did the same thing with just higher education in the Netherlands. So we recruited through Lean in Higher Educations, the Netherlands and Belgium, people from academic institutions in the Netherlands, and also had them sort the statements. And now we did the same thing with a group of international institutes of higher education. And for the Dutch sample, we use this as our archetypes. We had over 50 companies in total, and they represented all kinds of industries. It included education, aerospace engineering, healthcare, hospitals, production facilities, online travel agencies, all kinds of different companies. We had them go through the sorting exercise. And we found 3 perspectives. What we found was, for instance, that the most important thing is that, according to this group, is that continuous improvements initiatives such as Lean and Six Sigma should be linked to the business strategy. Number 1 critical success factor. And we also found that employees should be encouraged to make suggestions to improve performance, which is very consistent with the Dutch culture of empowering employees. Low power distance, employees should be in the lead. We also identified 3 distinct perspectives. One of them we called customer oriented, because it's for that particular perspective, it should be about the customer. The most important critical success factor was that projects should be linked to customers, and that customers should be consulted often, and that customer satisfaction should be measured often. The second one, we called it process oriented, and it's a little bit more closely related to Six Sigma, because the important critical success factors are linked to the outcomes. So continuous improvement projects must target process and product improvements. They must have a direct impact on financial goals, and training and tools needs to be provided. So a much more process-oriented, practical approach. And the third one was what we called people-oriented. So in that perspective, top management had to take a step back and delegate responsibility. Training was needed to create agents of change. Of course, if you're empowering people, you should give them the tools to do that. And employees should be encouraged to make suggestions to improve performance. So these were our three Dutch archetypes that we used a bit as a baseline. Now, think of my new sample of lean in higher education, and you can use the chats to put it in there. Which of the three perspectives that I just described do you think come closest to how people in higher education think about lean and the success factors of lean? Would it be more the customer-oriented side? Would it be more people-oriented, or would it be more process-oriented? You can put it in the chat. I can see it as well. I see a lot of process and people. I'm going to keep the answer to myself and let you figure it out from the rest of the presentation. Sorry. It's more fun that way. So going back to this. So we had our first sample, our Dutch, wide diversity of businesses, and then we focused on lean in higher education, the Netherlands and international. I'm just going to use them together now. Because the purpose of the study was to figure out the critical success factors of lean in higher education. So if you look at my three little balls, we're using diverse national cultures, a single organizational culture, because lean in higher education, and especially higher education, the culture across the world is relatively homogeneous. And most of you still use principally lean. So it was a very good setting, lean in higher education, to test whether the national culture makes a difference. So what did we do? We first had our Dutch sample. We collected responses from 26 participants. And for this presentation, I kept the data of only 18 because there was a bit of redundancy in which universities had answered. So if I had more than 2 respondents from each university, I removed the third and fourth. And we collected another set of responses from your group, Lean in Higher Education. And by the way, thank you so much to everyone that participated. 77 people filled out the survey, and another 27 filled out the Miro boards. So if you add up the 18 and the 27, I had quite a lot of data to go on, which was great. And what you see is that there were 3 bigger groups, US, UK, and the Netherlands, which gave me just enough data to try to see if there was a link between the national culture, or at least in this case, the country culture, and the perspectives that I identified. So 27 boards and 77 survey responses in total. And that's why you will see sometimes that the numbers just don't add up, because not everyone filled out everything. So sometimes the numbers deviate a little bit. So who were these respondents? Most people had at least a green or a black belt in Lean or Lean Six Sigma. Very few people were trained in only Six Sigma. Most were trained in at least Lean and Six Sigma, and sometimes something else, but not very often. The years of experience, most of the respondents were still relatively new to Lean and Lean Six Sigma, with fewer than 5 years of experience. So about half, and the rest was more experienced. And what was interesting from my perspective is that most respondents identified themselves as either working for operations or management, and very few as being involved in teaching or research in the primary process. And I think that has to do, of course, with the audience of the conference. But compared to other industries, that's a completely different distribution of respondents. Usually, most of the people I spoke to in business were involved in the primary process, even if they were doing lean on the side. And what about the institutions? I think the name of the conference says it all. So most institutions worked with at least lean and lean plus. Some of them combine lean and Six Sigma, but many also identified their process improvement as something else. And that could be continuous improvement or nothing. Some said, oh, we're not actually doing anything that has a name yet. Or we made it our own program and it has a few accents of agile, lean, Six Sigma, and we pick and choose the tools that fit us best. And what was also surprising is the direction of implementation. When I talked to the businesses, more than 80% of implementations were top down. Senior management decided we're going for lean or Six Sigma or any other form of continuous improvement. And it trickled down the organization. Whereas most respondents in my survey identified the approach that they were using as bottom up. We started somewhere in the organization and we're moving up. So I identified two perspectives. Don't try to read the fine print yet. I'll go through it in some detail. And the statistics, I'll spare you, but if you're interested, you're more than welcome to ask me afterwards how I got there. But I identified, based on my lean in higher education sample, two perspectives. And what I tried to figure out is if those two perspectives differed the most on national culture. And there was some difference. So perspective A was a little bit more closely related to European respondents, and perspective B a little bit closer to North American respondents, so US and Canada in this case. But that was not a statistically significant result, which was also quite hard to achieve with such a small sample. So it goes a little bit in that direction. So national culture, maybe not that big. What did make a huge difference is the background of the respondents themselves. So if you look at my two perspectives, most people that identified with perspective A had a lean background. And those that also had a bit of Six Sigma in there identified me more with the second perspective. But again, it showed that it had some influence. So what I did is I focused on where the biggest differences were, which were the idiosyncrasies of higher education. So the organizational culture of institutes of higher education, because that's what made the biggest difference. And I think as we go through the rest of the presentation, I think you might agree with me. So going back to what made this group special compared to the industry group, again, is the background in operations and management. And the management skewed a little bit more to the North American respondents. They more often identified themselves as being part of management. And in the European side of things, most people identified as being part of operations. But again, very few respondents identifying as lecturers, teachers, or researchers. So that's a bit different than the industry. So the focus on the supporting processes. The other thing, again, as I mentioned, is the implementation direction. It seems that in higher education, we decide we're going for lean or continuous improvement, or it starts in the organization and then we're trying to move it up. And that seems to not be working as well. So what were these two perspectives? Now we'll go a little bit more in depth. Well, one thing everyone agreed about is that employees should be encouraged to make suggestions to improve performance. And that's very consistent with the kind of environment that a university is, where highly skilled people get together, have their own expertise, and feel empowered to make suggestions and improve things themselves. And that also explains the bottom-up approach. one thing that normally comes back as really important, but here was only important for the first perspective, is lean projects should be linked to the business strategy. And that for me was surprising because there was such a wide gap. That's how you read it. For the orange perspective, it was very important. That's why it takes much more space. And for the green perspective, it was a lot less important. So if you think of your institution strategy, how would lean or continuous improvement fit in it? Is it a good strategy if you're trying to come up with ways in which your projects link to the strategy? And you can give some answers in the chat if you'd like. Is your institution strategy appropriate for lean? And this is the moment where you're like, what is my institution strategy? Do we have one? I'm just kidding, but I've worked for 5 universities now, maybe going on 6. And I wouldn't necessarily know what their mission, vision, strategy is beyond we want to be an excellence knowledge organization. Yes, who is orange and who is green? There is no clear who. There's 2 perspectives. I tried to find something that would be a little bit Scottish in terms of colors. But obviously I have to come and visit soon. So the European sample skewed towards the orange and the North American sample skewed towards the green. But right now I haven't given them specific names and I haven't put any people specifically in there. But going back to that strategy, it seems to be a bit of a challenge. If one of the most important critical success factors is linking projects to the strategy, and the strategy turns out not to be that important after all, how do you move on? Another thing that we looked at is product improvement, operational goals. So you see, one perspective considers operational goals a little bit more important, and another perspective considers process and product improvement as a little bit more important. There's a good overlap between the 2. And there's an emphasis also on information to employees. So what I did here, by the way, is I took the statements that were considered most important by at least one of the 2 perspectives, just because it's just a selection of the 34 that were available. And in the questionnaire, I had one open question that said, what are challenges for your implementation at your institution? And these were some of the quotes. Resistance from faculty in adopting campus-wide standards and measurements. Another challenge was helping teams determining their metrics, et cetera, et cetera. So even though being able to measure the impact of your projects is important, otherwise you don't know if you've achieved the operational goals, et cetera, there seems to be an issue with quantifying desirable objectives in higher education. So that's a second challenge. What do you do then? Then there were some strong thoughts about the role of middle managers in this whole process. And if you think about it, take a moment and think of your own organization. You can use the chat to give me an answer. What should be the role of middle management when you're implementing lean? Yeah, they need to be involved to bring their team. So they need to be supportive, motivating, interested, coach, And they sometimes also need to make sure that whoever's working on a project actually has the time to work on the project. They need to also define the priorities. They need to be the change champions. So they have a very big role in this lean implementation, especially if the senior leadership is not yet truly committed. So middle managers have a very important role in this. Thank you. And so one of the questions on the questionnaire was, how do you rate management commitment? At which stage are you? And it turns out that currently, most of my respondents at least thought that their managers expressed support for lean and approved time and resources for improvement work, but did not take an active role in the adoption. So they saw it mainly as something for employees to do. And that's halfway in where you would love to be if you truly had a successful lean implementation. And that's really actually a good first step. But it turns out that many people are also motivated by their leaders' behavior. So, modeling the desired behavior. And that's still something that needs attention. So going back to our perspectives, I actually looked at what was missing. So I took some statements that I was expecting to find. So this is a slightly different graph. And I showed you what the two perspectives considered important. So what my respondents in lean and higher education considered important. And then I thought, okay, but wait, there are a few things missing. So what I did then is I took the statements that normally come up as really important, and I looked up the scores of the two perspectives on there. So I took top management, and one perspective thought that top management should delegate responsibility and let us do the job. But actually nobody was expecting financial resources from top management. That's apparently not that important. But management still needs to take some responsibility for quality performance, and we're not going to tie their results to it. So where is senior leadership in lean implementation in higher education? So I looked back again to the comments and the open questions, and I found a few really interesting quotes there as well. Lack of support from senior leaders. That's a challenge for our implementation. Lack of committed resources, official position and office that takes care of things. Leadership needs to embrace lean beyond lip service. And there were another 10. These were the most representative. So in other words, there is the strong feeling that for most universities, senior leadership is not yet committed to lean. It's really something that comes bottom up. The other one that was really surprising to me, because so far I've mostly studied the business world, was the lack of customer orientation, or in this case, maybe student orientation or all other stakeholders. So most of the statements revolving around customer orientation were rated as really low, relatively speaking, or not as important. So what happened to our customer orientation? So I went back and I looked at all the critical success factors that were supposed to be important. And I started striking out all the ones that, well, we basically realized were not going to work really well in higher education. And well, there wasn't much left, which also explains why there were so many sessions in the conference about training, because training does work actually really well in higher education. It's our own mission, right? So then I looked a little bit further at a few other things that from experience I know can be a challenge in higher education. And one of them is cross-departmental cooperation. If you're trying to change something and improve something, you're trying to do it university-wide. And in higher education, many things happen in silos. And that's also what I saw from the information that the respondents provided. We're starting to connect different areas or departments into value chain, but that's an informal approach. That's a challenge if you're really trying to do something big. And the other one that I asked, that's the last one, is about problem solving. My experience as a teacher is we work by academic years. At the beginning of the academic year, we have huge drama trying to come up with a good list of who's coming to our university. And then we have all kinds of problems with enrollments. And then the enrollment period is over and suddenly we forget about those problems until the next academic year. So we tend to firefight, solve problems really well, but by the time the next opportunity comes, the problem is still there because the time gap was so long, nobody actually felt the urgency to solve it. And that's also what comes out of the data. There's a lot of improvement activities ad hoc, but there's no systematic approach. And that's part also from a teacher perspective in the way things are organized. Problems come back, but at such great time intervals that the urgency to solve them is not necessarily always there. So I was like, okay, I have to give a presentation about about critical success factors, and I've just crossed them out one by one off my list. What am I going to present about? And my conclusion so far is that higher education is its own culture. No matter where in the world we are, we all face quite similar problems. And that's going to require a quite similar solution that does not fit anything the academic literature says should happen. And for that, I would like to thank the few people I had interviews with who actually forced me to come up with, yes, but you need to offer us something at the end of your presentation. So let's start with a doom scenario. What's characteristic of higher education? Well, it's hard to define performance metrics. How do you measure great education? How do you measure fantastic research? So it's really hard to focus on what it is that we're providing to our customers. It's also that primary process, which is educating young and less young minds and coming up with new insights for the world to use. It's hard to improve that process because it's also hard to define that process. Because it's a co-creative process, it requires expertise, it requires students to be engaged, research subjects to actually answer questionnaires. So it's really hard to improve that process, which is no surprise why we mostly focus on the supporting processes in education. We tend to work in silos. Most universities have the School of Engineering, the School of Education, and so the education and the research happened in silos, but for most universities where I worked, the supporting processes are also their own silos. We have the financial department, we have student affairs, we have the international office. So it makes it very hard to improve processes that go across departments. And what I just mentioned, the cyclical nature of the work. I have a problem with enrollment, but that only happens June to August. Then there's an exam period and there might be some big issues there, but that's not going to come until 6 months later. So we tend to solve the problems, but by the time the problem comes again, there will be different people involved. It hasn't been documented well how the improvement should happen. So the cyclical nature makes it hard to sustain the improvements. So I'm going to put you in charge now. I'm going to give you what I consider the typical case of higher education based on your responses to the survey. Your senior leadership has little understanding of business processes. They think it's great that you're doing what you're doing, but they're really about the bigger picture. Your strategy, your institution has a strategy, but it's a little bit on the vague side. It's all about excellence and superior and amazing, but it's a little bit generic. And if you're at least in Europe and in the US, you work in what we call a relatively flat organizational structure. You might have one supervisor, and you might, but then the next layer above that is already senior leadership. So there aren't many managers around. And when they are around, they have a really big span of control. They have to solve many things. And the different departments work in silos. So if you need anything from finance, you actually have to go to finance and find the right person in finance that could help you solve that problem. So this is your case. And now I'm going to send you into breakout rooms, or someone will do that for me. And you have two missions. First, agree that your lean implementation is not doomed, even though I just ruined your day this morning by telling you that you don't meet any of the requirements for continuous improvement to be successful. I'm going to tell you that your lean implementation is not doomed. but you have to come up with a way to make it a success. So what are you going to do? This is your institution. You've been given carte blanche to find a way to make lean or continuous improvements a success. And I think you have 10 minutes, but if we see that you're done sooner, we'll bring you in sooner. Welcome back. So I'm curious to hear what some of your findings were, or some of your best ideas, if you'd be willing to put them in the chat for me. It's very quiet in the chat, so maybe I gave you a quite big challenge for 10 minutes. Yes, educating leadership about what lean is and what it's not. Yes. Engaging with the people closest to the activity and supporting them in their goals to improve services. Yes, I completely agree. That's a fantastic idea. Also true, it shouldn't be about cost cutting. Lean tends to have a bit of a reputation as a cost-cutting measure. Completely agree. And communicating about the value of lean. And actually, well, you stole my show, because that's really what I had on my last slide. And I did do a bit of extra research, because the great thing about the research I'm doing is I see the challenges, but I also get to see some wonderful examples, some good cases where things worked out really, really well. So what I did is I talked a little bit more with the places where I saw good things happening, and I came back with a few best practices that I'd like to share with you, keeping in mind that they're all subject to your own organization. And what did I find? You know, there's nothing wrong with going bottom up. If your senior leadership does not have the idea and they're not the ones initiating the change, well, then let's go bottom up. Let's start in the trenches. But then how do you take the next step to make it work beyond your own silo? What helps a lot is finding cross-departmental processes. Processes where multiple departments know something needs to be improved and they commit to working together. And then a challenge that happens with those, when you work on those cross-departmental processes, is that there's not always a single manager that can decide for you. So if you come up with improvement plans, a great idea, you might end up in a committee of 3 or 4 people, and they all need to approve it, and they all need to check it, and everyone needs to agree. So what helps is, when you start working on a process like that, is assigning ownership. Okay, this department is in charge of the improvement, and make sure that everyone agrees where the decisions will be made, so that your great improvement ideas do not get you know, put on the agenda of the next 5 meetings and nothing happens. So focus on cross-departmental processes and make sure to build a team around it. So people working across these different departments, all committed to that same cross-departmental process. And especially for things that happen on a cyclical nature, make sure that they get solved right there, right then, that it's clear what needs to happen next time, because then you're more likely to have a success. And when you have a success, make sure you celebrate it big, because there's nothing that's more contagious than joy, happiness, and success. Others see you do something really, really well and be happy about it, you know, ice cream, cake, confetti, that's the extent of it. They're going to get jealous and they're going to want in on it too. And at some point, when you have many successes, leadership will see it, and then they're going to experience the benefits of lean. And this is based on 2 universities that I spoke to, and it's not my idea, it's their idea. And that's how they did it. And what was really important for those 2 universities was keeping that budget. As a department, So in both those universities, improvements started within one department. They were one department that was implementing lean and was seeing the benefits. And one agreement that they made with senior leadership is any budget that we save doesn't go back into the pot. We get to keep as a department all the budget that we save through our improvements. And, they used it to throw a party the first couple of times, but then, there was too much budget for all those parties. So then they decided to use that budget to fund innovations within their departments. And, it's a virtuous circle. The more money you have to invest in good things, well, the more better things you can do. Workload was going down, so people had more free time to think about great things that they could improve, and they had time to work on these projects. So those virtuous circles resulted in a situation where that department had so much budget that they were willing to fund initiatives from other departments. And we're talking about a process of 5-6 years. It's not instantaneous. But what I wanted to say with that is there's nothing wrong with bottom up. You just need to make sure that it works towards up. And part of that is really by making sure you emphasize the good things that are happening. And that gets more buy-in than anything that you can impose on everyone. So that was my tips based on, the past 2 years of research. And I'd like to open it to questions at this stage.